Hello and welcome to the Osprey Games video channel. I'm Joe McCullough and today I'm joined by Robey Jenkins, the author of Horizon Wars, Science Fiction Combined Arms Wargaming. Thanks for coming, Robey.
No problem, thanks Joe.
So to start off, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you kind of came to wargaming, how you got involved?
Well, I've been wargaming most of my life that I can remember. I certainly started playing games in a structured way very young, at about 9 years old. But I was very much in and out of the wargaming hobby until Games Workshop released the Inquisitor rule set, which I know hasn't been everybody's cup of tea, but there was something about that rule that really drew me into gaming and games design, and that's the point at which I started writing campaigns, organising events, and actually really building on the idea of designing my own game. It sort of all rolled from there.
Yeah, I think Inquisitor is one of those games that really kind of brought creativity out of people.
There was so much left to do in the rule set when it was written. There was so much of the universe to explore that a lot of those of us that became very enthusiastic, even though we were only a small community, we did so much work building on Gav Thorpe's original rule set that it became a real passion, not just to play the game, but to play with the mechanics of the rules from the start.
Right. So, how about you explain to us how you kind of went from there to writing your own rule set and how Horizon Wars kind of came to be?
Well, I left the army for personal reasons, and at the time I then took on full-time parenting responsibility. And as a result, I needed something to fill the time when the children were in nursery that would make some money. I started painting miniatures professionally. Okay. But as anybody who paints miniatures professionally, particularly on a commission basis, finds out quickly, if you're not painting, you're not making money. And I wanted something a bit more sustainable. So I looked at the idea of trying to write my own rules. My first game that I wrote was a fantasy skirmish game, which I tried to self-publish. I won't pretend it was by any means a commercial success. I lost quite a lot of money trying to get that off the ground. But I learned from that experience. And I came back, and at the time when we were very short of cash, it was very hard to play any kind of war game at the time. I thought, I need a game I can play that is not going to cost me really any money at all, which was when I started writing the original version of Horizon Wars, which was called Mecha War. Yep. And it was purely a giant robots game. That's what I wanted. I wanted a game where I could throw a handful of giant robot minis onto the table and just have fun for an hour or two. And I'd already started writing the core rules for the game, and I'd based it on the idea of having 3 mass levels, 1, 2 and 3, 1 being a light mech and 3 being a heavy mech, when I came across EM4 Miniatures box set of plastic mechs, which conveniently came in 3 sizes, small, medium and large, and was only £2.65 for 5 mechs. And I was like, yeah, these are the models for my game. This is what I want. So it really wasn't that hard. Even really scrabbling for money at the time, it wasn't that hard to just get 2 or 3 boxes of these mechs, get very basic paint jobs on them, and throw Mecha War down on the table. And I was pleased enough with the rules that I thought, well, I'll publish this. But I've been down the self-publishing line before. It's not expensive, but it does take some investment of cash. I don't have time for this. I'll put them up on my website, set up my website so that people could buy the rules for £1. And I called it £1 War Games.
Right.
And it would be wrong to say it flew off the shelves, but I certainly sold several hundred copies through that. Plus, I put a rider in the rules saying, you've bought these for £1. Feel free to share them with your friends. Don't feel that you have to hold on to them. Just spread them around. And then, if you haven't paid £1 for these rules, but you've got them from a friend and you like them, you can PayPal me £1 to this address. Okay. And again, it was just £10 or £20 a month was coming in from it. I was really, really pleased. And enough people were asking, what else are you going to do? That I went, well, EM4 also make a box of spaceships that look awfully like sci-fi atmospheric flyers. I'll write some aircraft rules to go with those. So I then wrote the aircraft rules, released it as a separate game called Airframe, but based on the same basic rule set, so the two could work in parallel if you want to have mechs supported by aircraft. And then inevitably, everybody started asking, what about the rest of the combined arms battle group? I was like, yeah, okay, I will get around to that. And I did. I wrote a beta version of those rules called Battle Group. And the intent was, having written Mecha War, Airframe, Battle Group, that they'd all be separate £1 war games. You could buy each of them for £1, and that's how I would sell them. Mm-hmm. But as I was finishing up Battle Group, I was thinking, well, I could just... People might just want, rather than have effectively the same rules repeated 3 times with tweaks, they might like to just have one set of rules that tells them everything. And it would be like the trilogy box set. Well, if I was going to do that, it would be nice to do it properly and get some art in there and get a setting written for it. I'd probably need to kickstart that or something. And I had some friends who'd already done Kickstarters, and so I knew what was involved in times of work. I thought, God, that's going to be a lot of work. And by chance, I already had Phil Smith's email. Because back when Osprey Games first kicked off, he put out an open call. And I sent him that fantasy skirmish game that I first tried. And he'd come back to me and said, looks like a really nice tight set of rules, not what we're looking for right now. I was like, fine. But I had his email address. So before committing to a Kickstarter, I thought, well, I'll just see. So I threw Phil an email. I said, I've got this. This is what it looks like. This is what I'm thinking of doing. Are you interested? And Phil came back and said, yeah, we're interested. We'll take another look at that. Send me the finished manuscript. And I understand he's getting used to his bionic hand now. Because I did bite off the original with that offer. And that's where it rolled from. Okay. And hence Horizon Wars.
Well, I hope you're happy with the
it's
finished
fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I love Jasada's art. It's just gorgeous. Exactly what I could have hoped for.
So, game designer question here, kind of one game designer to another, and with the threat of going into deep math, but let's try to avoid too much of it. One of the things that I found really interesting about Horizon Wars is the combat system. It uses multiple D12s, and it uses both players rolling D12s. Mm-hmm. And it's a system that I find intriguing because I can't mentally kind of figure out the probability of it. It's too complex. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a very, very good way. But maybe you could tell me a little bit of just kind of how you got to there, because it's not...
Well, I'd like to emphasize, I hope the process of playing is really simple.
It is. It's fast.
Because for the basis of your view is, when you're shooting, you roll a number of D12s. And you add them up to get a target number. Yep. And you can create little groups of dice, and the more groups of dice you can create that meet your target number is the more hits you've got. Meanwhile, your opponent is rolling D12s, but they're not trying to beat your dice, they're trying to match them exactly. And if they exactly match one dice to one dice, those dice cancel out. So they reduce the number of dice you have to make up groups to create hits. And it's really quite straightforward to play, but you're right, the statistics of it, and I did do a lot of math trying to understand where the probabilities all lay, which is why I came down to the matching idea rather than the beating idea. Why D12s basically goes back to it works. You need a certain breadth of probability in any game. D6s didn't give sufficient breadth. D10s I didn't quite feel gave enough breadth, even though, thanks to Inquisitor, I already had dozens of D10s. I said, no, that doesn't quite work. D20s were too fiddly, because you're rolling, I mean, you can be rolling 7 or 8 at a time, and it was just too many to roll. So I scaled it back, and D12 is where it's at. I was already predisposed to D12s, although I'm not a mathematician, I have a mathematical background, and 12 is a mathematically very satisfying number. And there are many people who will argue that if we did maths in base 12 rather than base 10, it would actually make maths much easier. And there is some of that in the calculations for Horizon Wars. But yeah, it's... What can I say? It works. It all adds up in the end. And also the 12 thing fits because we tend to work in inches as wargamers. And again, that's a base 12 system, so it matches across that as well.
All right, so final question here. Horizon Wars, and this is perhaps a little odd for wargames. It has a background.
Yeah.
It is the last thing that appears in the book.
Sort of.
Well, close to the last thing. How important do you see that background? Is that something you've been working on a long time? Is that something you feel is integral for the game, or?
It was actually one of the last things I wrote was the setting. Mecha War and Airframe and Battle Group had no setting.
Right.
When it came to putting Horizon Wars together, I decided to write a setting for it for two reasons. First of all, I'm a sci-fi fan, and I've written sci-fi fiction before. But also because I feel that people needed to be told that this is not a game for one place and one time. This is not a game that is just near-future sci-fi. This is not a game that is just distant future sci-fi. This game is flexible across all of those. So rather than write a single setting, I wrote what amounts to a history. From the beginning of the story starts at 100 years' time, and the end of the story is some centuries in the future. And the idea was to look at why warfare might occur under different historical circumstances and how it would be fought differently under those circumstances. But it was also very important to me that the setting is not completely serious.
Right.
War is a very serious matter. I'm ex-army officer myself. In fact, I was in the medical corps, so the question of casualties and wounding and the impact of warfare is something I'm very intimate with. And I didn't want people either to think that our setting was trivialising war, or that I was trying to make any serious political predictions about the near future. So the story is very tongue-in-cheek. It has a lot of references to not popular culture so much as historical curiosities.
Right.
And stories from the media and people's perception of how society is going. So in the first process, basically World War III is initiated when the British decide that the French need a good kicking. And this also explains why they thought that giant walking tanks were a good idea, when in all practical military senses they really aren't.
Yep.
Because they literally wanted to give the French a good kicking.
Right.
And that initiates World War III. The world starts falling apart. There are radiated sections in Central Europe, in North America, in Central Russia, and gradually society falls apart. But all of this has been orchestrated, it's heavily hinted, by a group of what are called melds. Melds are a little bit like artificial intelligences, but rather than being fully artificial, they are actually composed of Gestalt minds. So you get what's called the Gestalt workers movement, was when people effectively surrender use of their brain for a number of hours a day, where they just go into kind of internet mode, like we've got, rather than looking at cat videos or playing, I'm trying to think of a good one, Jungle Gems or whatever the latest thing is.
Angry Birds.
You give up your brain. The brains are then formed into a network of connected brains which can think deeper, harder, longer about bigger issues in ways that then manage whole economies. And the Gestalt worker movement is vast. But the identities, the personalities that arise, are not always in sync with the brains that make up those identities.
Okay.
So they have their own agenda, and they are a manipulative force behind the scenes. Now, to what extent they're manipulating the British or anybody else, there's not that much detail, but that's what's happening in the background. But the course of the battle annihilates the Gestalt minds, because they all rely on people's brains, and the brains gradually are picked off one by one until the Gestalts get smaller and smaller and smaller. They eventually become more humane, and they respond by re-establishing civilization on a city basis. And the new corporations are going to celebrate a new humanity by colonising Mars and colonising Venus. But the two corporations that commit to colonising the two planets don't realise at the outset what a terrible money sink it's going to be. And because they're in competition for people's hearts and minds as well as for money, they won't admit publicly what a money sink it is when they realise. And so they start fighting each other for resources, both on Mars and on Venus and on Earth, and so you get the new colonial wars. They progress until finally the two corporations just kill each other and they're dead, and you've got these colonies on Mars and Venus surviving against the odds. Earth is going, well, what do we do now these corporations have gone? But the Earth population have become obsessed with following the warfare through the media, and it's become the latest reality TV craze. Right. And they're hungry for more. And so at that point, the media corporations start sponsoring the wars. So the wars carry on Mars and Venus, even though the corporations that founded them are dead, because the viewing population on Earth wants to see more. Finally, eventually they see sense. Peace is called off. The public is still hungry, so they create a brand new sport on Earth. Basically, we call it the Mall, which is short for Mecha Ball, which is mechs playing football, broadly speaking. There might one day be rules for that, we'll see. But it starts off just as set-piece battles on Earth to entertain the masses. Right. Life goes on. Asteroid hits Earth. Earth is wiped out. Mars and Venus return to Earth in the hope of recolonising the planet and rescuing the survivors. But there's a mystery, because before Earth was destroyed, there was an EM blackout, and when Mars and Venus arrived to rescue the survivors, there are far fewer survivors than there ought to be. Gradually it becomes clear that something weird has happened on Earth, and there's this thing called the slap drive. Mm-hmm. And it looks like large portions of Earth just abandoned the planet. They don't know why, they don't know how, but they know this slap drive is involved. Suddenly, the fight between Venus and Mars to recolonise the world becomes a fight for the slap drive. Okay. Eventually, Venus wins, but they then quit Earth, build a slap drive, vanish, and Venus is occupied. So the Martians are left to control the solar system, and we get a new human golden age. Artificial intelligences grow up. The lines between different types of Sophont are completely blurred, and it's hard to tell who's human, who's machine these days. And it's a wonderful time. And of course, eventually they too master the slap drive, and they start sending drones out into the galaxy to explore and expand, and they discover that there are parts of the galaxy where their drones just don't come back. And they start getting scared. There's something nasty out there in the darkness. Is it the Venusians? Is it the lost tribes of Earth? Is it something else that wants to eat my face? I don't know. So they all start getting a little bit antsy, and they start learning martial arts again, and they start forming militia. Now, all of them have got their brains backed up, and they've got multiple bodies, so they can do anything. Doesn't matter if they get killed, they've got a spare back at home. So suddenly warfare becomes fashionable, very trendy, and all the spaceships look like warships, and everybody's got their own mech and carries sidearms, and dueling becomes fashionable, and eventually they become strong. And they become confident, and they think, yeah, we can take on anything the galaxy can throw at us. And they head off out into the darkness. And that's pretty much the end of the story. All right. So we've got 4 distinct periods of time. The original war, the fight for Mars and Venus, followed by Mecha Ball, the fight for Earth, and then into the darkness. Right. And anything can happen. And that sort of shows people that the game itself can apply to any kind of future conflict. Even, to be honest, modern or pre-modern conflict. Anything after Second World War will more or less work. All right.
Well, thanks for giving us that, and thanks for answering our questions today. That's probably all the time we have for today. Horizon Wars, it's going to be released on April 21st in the UK, April 19th in the United States. However, you will have a couple of chances to buy it early. If you're going to Adepticon in Chicago, we'll have it there. If you're going to Salute in London, we'll also have it there. We'll also have Robey with us at Salute for a couple hours. He'll be on the stand saying hi, signing books. So come on by Salute and say hello. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.